Jonathan Cristol. He's an international security and foreign policy expert. He's also a research fellow at Adelphi University and a senior fellow at Bard College. Jonathan, thank you for joining us. First, I want to ask you, what do you make of the DPRK foreign minister's Ring Yong-ho's comments that the U.S. can't be trusted?
Well, I think that trust is a two-way street. It is true that the U.S. hasn't gone as far as the DPRK might have liked in past rounds of negotiations in the 90s and the early 2000s. And they also are certainly hearing mixed messages, a more conciliatory Donald Trump with a bit more of a hard line Mike Pompeo. And so it's understandable why, of course, they'd say that. But on the other hand, you also have a Pyongyang that has either violated or withdrawn from virtually every discussion or agreement that they've reached with the U.S. on their nuclear program over a long period of time. So I think this speech certainly was understandable. I think it was a pretty solid effort. But I think that both sides have a lot of reason to be wary of each other.
Do you think this speech changes anything in the progress or lack of progress made between the U.S. and DPRK?
Well, I don't think it necessarily changes anything, but in what is, in general, a fairly delicate situation, I think that giving a speech that leaves the door open to further talks, certainly between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, I think that not upsetting the current status quo is itself a good thing and probably about as good as you're going to get.
I also want to talk about Syria. The Foreign Minister Walid Mualem also spoke there on Saturday at the UN General Assembly. He said his country will be free of foreign troops, and he called on the refugees to come home. Two very bold statements.
Well, the Syrian Foreign Minister's speech made North Korea's speech look like it was given by sort of Abraham Lincoln it was a sort of, the Syrian speech was a textbook definition of dishonesty in almost every regard. He laid out he blamed the U.S. and the international community for the destruction in Raqqa, for the refugee crisis itself, for almost every sort of tragedy that's befallen Syria. And so I think that in the context of the wider speech, there's almost nothing that he said that I would put too much stock in. I don't think that the refugees will be returning to Syria anytime soon. I think in fact, quite the contrary. I think that as refugees establish sort of new lives in other places, either in the region or in outside the region, that more and more people, family members, will be moving to join them. People who couldn't move when the war was at its height will be able to go when it dies down. And the foreign minister sort of implied that this was the end of the conflict. Now, look, there's less happening maybe than 2 or 3 years ago, but I'm not sure we're at the end of the conflict. It's a sort of miniature world war that has no real end in sight, in my view.
He said Syria's civil war was 7 years of fighting terrorism. Jonathan Cristol, thank you so much for joining us live from New York.